purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.
I think as I please, and this
Welcome to
gives
Freethought
me
Forum.
pleasure.
I'm here with Sally Chizek. My name is Hugh Henry. I'm the host of your program. We're going to present Sally's skit, The Good Book, and then she and I and Mr. James Barrot will discuss it. Now, this contains some of the raciest parts of the Bible, and you may find the language offensive even though it comes from the Bible, especially for children. So, please be warned on this. Without further ado, Sally, shall we begin?
All right. In Nampa, Idaho, some moralists decided to circulate a petition requesting the library to remove any books that might be offensive to children under the age of 18. So one of the men, just one of the citizens, wrote in. His name is Guerrero Bennett, and he wrote a guest opinion for the Idaho Press Tribune, in which he supported, tongue-in-cheek, the idea of removing sexually explicit material. His letter to the editor.
A man rapes a woman, causing the woman's brothers to slay every man in the rapist's village. In addition, the brothers take the women and the children captive and loot the village. Is this any way to teach children the concept of justice?
A daughter-in-law disguises herself and seduces her father-in-law, who thinks she is just a common harlot. She becomes pregnant, and her father-in-law seeks to kill her until his whole family learns what he has done. Is this any way to teach children about marriage?
A man gets drunk and has sex with his daughters, getting both of them pregnant. With all the reports of incest, should the library stock such books?
Favorite treatment of a wise leader who has hundreds of princesses and hundreds of concubines. Is this any way to teach children about monogamy?
Use of a young virgin to enable an old king to get an erection. Should young children be exposed to what appears to be child molestation?
Description of a son having sex with his father's concubines in full view of everyone. This makes today's television seem tame. Should children be taught that this is acceptable behavior?
A favorable description of a king who sends a man to his death so he can have his wife, even as he loves another man. When in a good mood, he exposes himself to people and locks up anyone who complains, and he loves to have sex with concubines. Should the tender minds of youngsters be exposed to such filth?
A mother-in-law instructs her daughter-in-law to sleep with a kinsman in order to have security. Why should innocent children learn that the way to a secure life is through sex?
What are these sex books that the Napa Library is making available to children under 18? Well, the book of Genesis, 1 Kings, 1 and 2 Samuel, the book of Ruth, all in the Holy Bible. This book is so sexually charged and so full of violence that Bishop Porteous declared nearly half the Hebrew Bible and some of the New Testament too hot to handle. One hopes that Alan Marsh and his hot-eyed minions will lead the charge to remove all Bibles from the Napa Library so that library users under the age of 18 won't be exposed to such blatant sexuality, depravity, and bloodthirsty violence.
In a message dated December 26, 01, Jay Vale, the opinion editor, writes to Mr. Bennett. He says, "Dear Mr. Bennett, I regret to inform you that after reviewing your guest opinion, managing editor Vicki Holbrook has determined that it is just too graphic for our readers. Therefore, we won't be able to publish it in its current form. Thanks for your contribution to our opinion page, and I hope to hear from you in the future.
Dear Mr. Vail, you mean the Holy Bible is too graphic for publication? Gary?
That's the conclusion.
Well, Sally, since this is your beast, you want to start this off?
Okay, now you were showing books earlier, so I'll show mine. This is the Holy Bible in large print. I want to just kind of give a little summary of the Bible. And I'll give some of it, and then I'll give y'all a chance to say something, because I certainly don't want to hog the limelight here. But the Bible was written over several thousand years by about 40 individuals and groups. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and the New Testament was written in Greek. The New Testament contains 4 Gospels, a lot of history, 14 letters, which only about half are authenticated. The rest are probably bogus. Do you know why the Gospels were written?
All right. Why were the Gospels written?
Do you?
Well, they were four of the disciples of supposedly of Jesus, and they were, I think, a lot of them are written in order to form a rule for the new Christian church in order to explain the positions that it took.
I know that we talk
right.
about the gospel truth. They weren't written for the disciples of Jesus because they were written a long time later. But they were not actually intended by the writers to be history. What they actually mean is the good news. It's like, this is what Christians believe. This is what Christianity is about. And that's what they were supposed to express. There were also many more Gospels than the 4 we know. The four we know were the most accepted, and they were the ones that made it into the Bible. But there were a lot of others.
But the main reason that they were written was because Jesus did not return immediately like he had promised. So these Gospels were written so that they could explain that and keep on with the religion. Do you have something to add to any of this now?
Well, what I wanted to talk about, of course, is going back into the Old Testament.
That's where most of this stuff that you got came from.
And it was 3 areas in the Old Testament that I wonder how they can possibly be handled, since the contradictions are so great, and it calls on just ordinary intelligence to figure out what they mean. To start with the story of creation, and it talks about the different days that God used to create the world. Now, it's amazing that he created plants and before he created the sun. And I mentioned this to a Christian one time, and she said, well, did you ever hear photosynthesis? And I said, well, photosynthesis requires a sun, first of all, and it also requires animal life, which they had not created yet. And so I'm surprised that you mentioned photosynthesis.
Well, technically you're wrong on the animal life, but go ahead.
Well, no, photosynthesis requires the exchange of oxygen and
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide.
And there was lots of carbon dioxide and very little oxygen. So photosynthesis first shifted a lot of carbon dioxide into oxygen, and it came before animals.
Voice.
But then God, according to one account, created the animals first. Then he created Adam, and he gave Adam the choice of selecting any one of the animals for his mate. And apparently Adam wasn't excited by one of the gorillas. It didn't seem to think a giraffe could make a good mate. And I'm wondering about God's ability to choose from his creation. And then he finally had to create a woman out of Adam's rib for him. That's one of the next area that seems amazing to me is Noah's Ark. I think that the story is so far-reaching. In the first place, the creation of this boat, the millions of types of animals, and some of them were in. How did he get the sleuth there from as far off reach? It would have taken years for the sleuth to ever reach Noah's Ark.
Well, they used FedEx.
Oh, maybe that's true.
But some Christians explain all this, not fundamentalists, of course, but some Christians explaining all this by saying, well, this is allegory. This is not literal. This is allegory.
Well, then
then they turn around and say it is literal.
Then in that case, what areas do you choose to be allegory? Or
the ones I like are true. The others are allegory.
The other churches is allegory.
Yeah, yes.
Before we go any further, I do want to say the information that I'm giving out here is from the Promethean Humanist. So I just want to give credit where credit is due. And going along with what you said about the Old Testament, and this explains a little bit why it's so confusing. It says that the first 5 books of the Old Testament were written by 4 authors, maybe even more. And that the rabbis, who are teachers, had 2 versions of the Old Testament, but they dared not discard either one, so they combined them. And when they did that, then they made a big mess. Then the texts were interlaced. They produced interruptions. There was conflicts with the narratives and duplications. Then you had 2 creationisms, 10 commandments, and Noah's flood. All of that was all meshed together, and it didn't come out good.
Well, part of the problem, I understand, I don't know this that well, was that the captivity of the Jews in Babylon caused a great deal of loss of what they'd had before. And they had to reconstruct the Bible, the Torah, after they came back from Babylon. And it was a very difficult reconstruction. Now, recently, the Jewish Conservative Church here in the United States, I think it's the Conservatives, have issued a new official commentary on the Torah, and in which they say that there is no archaeological evidence anywhere for the Jews' exodus from Egypt, that they were never, not that they were never there, but that there is no evidence. And
outside the Bible, you mean?
Yeah. There's no archaeological evidence. And there's no archaeological evidence for some of the stories, for instance, the fall of Jericho and so forth. This doesn't mean they didn't happen. It means there's no evidence. And we know from the case of the Egyptians that if you look at Egyptian monuments, they have Egyptian battle scenes. And funniest thing, none of them the Egyptians ever lost, including the ones we know from what happened next, they damn well did. We also know that they edited King Tut completely out. Not King Tut, Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, was completely edited out of Egyptian everything.
Because he worshipped the sun?
Yeah, he worshipped the sun and not the other Egyptian gods. Yeah. So they're very capable of editing history and removing parts they don't like.
Oh, sure.
But be that as it may, as they said, there is no archaeological evidence backing up a good deal of this. So a lot of the most god-awful parts of the Bible, of the massacres and so forth, could very well be war stories, like a cat that bushes itself up to make itself look bigger. A small people in a land that keeps getting invaded might bust themselves up to make them look really mean and nasty.
Yes.
Well, some of the stories, for instance, the creation and the flood, can also be found in the Gilgamesh, and also in the Persian or the Syrian Zoroastrians used a lot of those stories. So I wonder that the Jewish Bible didn't borrow a lot of those same stories, because
they could have picked that stuff up while they were in Babylon too.
That's correct.
This book, Promethean Humanist, also says that the Bible shows that there was a lot of influence from the ideas brought on just by travelers on the trade routes from the Eastern Mediterranean. And it is a small portion of the many texts. So the Bible is just a small portion of the many texts that were available 2,000 years ago. And that doesn't mean that the Bible doesn't have some value. That's a very long, ancient stories. So, they're that in that respect. But for them to set up rules for us to live by, and as you did in the previous program, where Carol was saying that they want to go back to the laws of the Old Testament, I don't think we have enough rocks because they were very fond of stoning people to death for very minor. In fact, a disobedient son, you got stoned to death.
Well, I understand that the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are some of the earliest versions of the Old Testament we have, and fragments of earlier ones, are consistent with the texts we have today. They're not different. They're very, very nice and close. But they only go back maybe, 1,000 or so years before the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is close to the time of Christ. They don't go all the way back into the history which is covered.
Well, I'm sure that Christ would be quite surprised if he'd read what's in the Bible and about his life.
I'm sure he would. There is a gospel, a Gnostic gospel, a gospel that was not accepted as part of the Bible, but was discovered in another Dead Sea Scroll type arrangement, the Nag Hammadi scrolls, called the Gospel of Thomas, which is believed by many to be as close to exactly what Christ said as you could get. But you have to go...
nobody was there who wrote
this was
things.
This was
Nobody
supposed to
was
be
there.
close to contemporary when this was written.
There was a Dr. Menza that wrote a version of the Bible, and he claimed, and I've heard others claim, that you had to understand the customs and the meanings of those days in order to, and so he interpreted. Of course, he still interpreted quite a bit of stoning and punishment. It was just merely a difference of opinion on what the meanings of different texts were.
Well, has stoning gone out altogether?
I don't think there was.
think so.
I don't think so. And there was a recent case of a Muslim family that the father cut his daughter's throat because she did not obey the rules, and he claimed it was
Was it to
religious.
do with the headscarves?
I thought it was to do with her staying out or something like that. It may have been, but maybe you're right. I just read the account in the paper. And
I believe there's a current case of stoning in Saudi Arabia, I think, that is being protested on a worldwide scale. It hasn't happened yet, I don't believe, but it is being protested. This is under the Shara law of the Quran.
mm-hmm.
There's an awful lot of stuff that shocks us now that would have been quite contemporary. For example, the sacrifice of Isaac was something that happened all the time with the gods of the time. And in fact, by sparing Isaac's life, God was being much nicer than his contemporary gods, because they would have said, fine, slit his throat, we'll take the blood.
Well,
that was the other gods around.
The sacrifice of Christ, and of course the communion, is interpreted by, the Catholic Church, and I think a lot of the Protestant churches, being that you're partaking of his actual flesh and his actual blood, which I think is a throwback to human sacrifice and to cannibalism.
Yeah, that's pretty nasty.
Well, it is ritual cannibalism.
That's right.
Yes.
And they believe it's not just symbolism. I mean, the Catholic
Yeah,
Church.
the transubstantiation.
Yes.
It actually becomes that after it's blessed.
And in this summary of the Bible, it also says that many ideas are borrowed from other nations about the communion with bread and wine, and also given a tenth of your possessions to priests. Yeah. It says priests, but of course we know that means clergy, any clergy.
That's correct.
They're still asking for their 10% today.
Well, as a matter of fact, they asked for, I can remember where they said 10% is what you owe, and any gifts is anything you give above the 10%.
Well, no wonder they have all the bucks. Huh?
Well, part of that was what people came to America to get away from. In England, I've seen the tithe barns where the tenth of the harvest was put away. And those were the only barns in England. That was it. When they came to the United States, Americans were very proud and happy, proud as peacocks, to have their own barns where their stuff went.
And if they had just left their religion behind, they would have been a lot better.
In fact, the expression knock on wood comes from what they would do after they took an admiring look at their barn and what was in it.
Oh, that's interesting. I always like to know why we say certain things. We say things all the time. We don't really know why we say them, but we say them anyway.
And the attending church in many communities in the United States was a must. In fact, they had a person that went up and down the aisle in the church, and he had a long rod. Anybody that started dozing got a rap on the head.
Or else they would tickle you with a feather.
Yeah.
Massachusetts had established state religion until 1820. It didn't end with the Constitution. And in the Massachusetts colony, I believe earlier, if you didn't go to church, you paid a fine. It was automatic.
And they're trying to get those times back, aren't they? Well, I also had in this article about the contents of the Bible. Some is just so ridiculous, although there's some that are sublime too. But one of the most ridiculous one, I think, is this. True Christians can pick up serpents and drink harmful things without suffering. That's Mark 16, 17 to 28. And of course, there are some religions that do that.
And they get away.
Handle snakes.
And they get away with it. They actually prove that out.
That they can get away with it?
Yes.
Because they're true Christians?
Well, we don't necessarily know the reason, but they do get away with it. They can actually safely handle poisonous snakes.
Wouldn't any snake handler? Some of them can get away with it and some that can't?
This is a little different.
I'd like to answer that. First of all, not all of them do get away with it.
That's true.
There have been many that
there have been
many of them die. But the fact is that snakes get used to being handled. I saw on one of the TV programs that they had a family in India, I think it was India, that had a pet cobra.
Yeah.
And the children played with it and everything else. It was because the snake was used to being handled. And so I believe that these snakes are used to being handled, and that they, as long as they handle them correctly, they usually will not bite. But as it's shown, that quite often they do bite. And also, your system can get used to certain poisons, and as long as they. But I would like them to see them take a cobra that has not been handled and put in there and see what happens then.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jim.
Yeah, it's the neurotoxins like the cobras and the coral snake you can develop a tolerance for. But the destructive toxins, the ones that actually destroy tissue, and not much you can do about the rattlesnakes and the copperheads and the moccasins. There's not a lot you can do about those.
You mean you can't have a friendly relationship with them?
Well, I'm talking about the poison itself.
Oh, the poison, okay.
If that gets you, it's going to start eating tissue. It's going to start digesting it and wrecking it.
Well, anyway, I'm certainly glad that my parents weren't in that religion when I was born. The 5 books that are attributed to Moses. Well, I have read several articles saying that this may be a complete myth because he describes his own burial, and also they contain 613 laws which Jews are supposed to obey. That's an awful lot of laws. Well, of course, I'm sure we have more than that, but this 16 and 13, they were bound to keep them. And one of the things was such as you must not boil a kid, meaning a goat, in its mother's milk. And then they should stone to death a disobedient son or an impure daughter. that those are attributed to Moses.
Well,
So,
about those laws, the explanation that's given is that these are God's chosen people. And the rest of us are off the hook. But if you're Jewish, sorry guy, you're stuck.
most of them were
You've gotta keep
dietary, you think?
They were meant to separate. The purpose, in part, was to separate. To say, you are different, and this is the mark that you are different. You are different from all the rest of us, and this is part of it. You are my chosen people, so you have to obey these laws. The rest of the people are off the hook, but you aren't.
So then the Catholic Church is sort of like that too. They have their rituals and their laws so that they are separate. And you must become a Catholic to, get in on some of these benefits.
Didn't Moses describe going into the land of Canaan, which the promised land, which of course he was not able to do in the first 5 books of the.
Yeah, and I
Moses.
forgot why he wasn't able to go to the promised land.
Because he broke the first commandments when he got mad at the. I believe that's the reason, because he got mad at the
Golden calf thing.
golden calf that they had built, and so he got mad and broke, and he had to go back and get another one. I believe that was his punishment for doing that.
Well, that seems kind of
Well,
hard.
Well, that is what the Ark of the Covenant is supposed to contain. So that's pretty serious stuff to go smashing up what they have to build an ark to hold.
What's it supposed to contain? The laws or
The tablets.
The tablets. Oh.
That's what's supposed to be in the Ark of the Covenant, is the actual tablets given to Moses. And those tablets are the covenant, or the contract, or the agreement.
Well, why did the Israelites violated the laws that were in the 10 Commandments that they had not yet seen? Why were they
Punished for that.
That's right.
Well, I'm afraid you'll have to see God about that.
Well, we thought we were. I have this, the Holy Bible here, and so it seems here that the stories in Genesis 1 and 2 are mostly taken from Mesopotamia. Do you remember the?
Don't try it more than once.
You know what the area is now?
Yes.
What?
Oh, Mesopotamia, the land between. It's the land of the rivers.
Yeah, but what are the countries named now, like Turkey and?
That would be
now it's
that
Turkey.
would be, no, that would be Iraq.
Iraq
And a little bit of Turkey and a little bit of Jordan, but you're going to have to make your point quick because we're running a little thin right now.
Oh, okay. Well, the thing I was going to say is that some of the things in the Bible, like the Psalms 19 and 104, were learned from the bondage in Egypt, and so I'm not going to read it now. We have so little time. And the story of Job was borrowed from Arabia, and also the Christians adopted Greek and Roman pagan ideas, and you probably know a lot about that.
Well, whether I do or not, we're
We don't have
close
time.
to the end. This is Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum, along with Sally Chizek and
Jim Barrot.
Jim Barrot. Thank you very much.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Decadent and sin fra